And they don't see it this way. Why? Why don't they see it as just a disagreement? Because of this whole thing about, remember, introjects and everything being in such an extreme, and because of splitting, and because of the lack of integration, like good and bad, they don't see it as just an agreement because they lose sight of all the good aspects of their partner. They just disappear. That's part of splitting. It's like it could have been there just 5 minutes ago, and they could have really appreciated you or look forward to seeing you. They love you. But when they're splitting, that disappears at that moment. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm thrilled to bring to you an interview I had with Lisa Taylor Austin. Lisa is a highly respected psychotherapist in private practice, where she integrates her experience as an EMDR-trained therapist to help clients navigate their mental health challenges. Alongside her clinical work, Lisa shares her insights on her video channel, where she educates and empowers a wider audience. What I'm about to play for you is part 2 of our 2-part discussion on some concepts that are really important to understand if you're dealing with narcissistic characteristics, either your own or perhaps someone who's close to you in your life. I strongly encourage you to check out part 1, which is available on Lisa's channel. I'll include a link to her channel in the show notes below, where you can find that episode and other fascinating material she's created. Our discussion was quite extensive, so I've divided this into 2 segments. What I'm about to play is the first cut of part 2 of this interview, if that makes sense. This is where we delve deeper into how narcissistic patterns of projection, introjection, and splitting manifest in relationships. And we also begin to explore effective approaches for managing and understanding these traits. Without further ado, here's our discussion. I hope you find it insightful and thought-provoking.
Hello. In today's video, we'll be discussing narcissistic personality disorder. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Taylor Austin, licensed psychotherapist and expert witness. I'll be talking today with my special guest, Dr. Anthony Mazzella, a psychoanalyst in New York City who treats people with narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. Dr. Mazzella also has a successful podcast called The Narcissismdecoder. It's so nice to speak with you today, Dr. Mazzella.
Hi, Lisa. I'm really happy to be back again. I have very fond memories of our last conversation. I'm really happy you gave me this opportunity for us to talk about this a bit more.
Yes, I'm very excited. And just to let our listeners know, we talked previously about introjects that happen with narcissistic personality disorder and also splitting. I don't know if you want to do a recap or just refer people back to that.
Yeah, I think if people haven't had the opportunity, because we went into far more detail than this brief recap, but basically Lisa introduced this really complicated concept that's critical to understand when thinking about living with somebody who has a personality disorder, and it's called introjects. And we went into some detail about how they are established, what they mean, what role they play in our lives today, and then how to work with them. But we didn't go in too deep into how to work with them because we ran out of time. And we're hoping to do that today because Lisa has more really thought-provoking questions. So I would say let's jump into your questions. And then sort of by way of review as we go forward, we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit. But anyone who's interested, yes, definitely check out part 1 for a deeper dive into introjects and splitting.
Thank you. And I want to just comment that your explanation of introjects and splitting is unlike any other explanation I've heard before. So I really encourage people to go listen to it because it was helpful for me to hear what you had to say. And I know it'll be helpful for many other people as well.
Thanks for saying that. And I just want to respond to it quickly. I think what I said was very different because oftentimes if you look at or listen to social media, like the content there, it's very rare that people have a theory in terms of why somebody is behaving the way that they do. Descriptively, people do a really great job describing, like certain behaviors and then how people respond. But if you really want to relate to somebody or treat somebody like this in your life, you need a theory in mind, because a theory sort of guides the way you're going to respond to them. And that's what we did. We went into a little bit of theory because we needed to understand introjects and then how they play out. So thanks for saying that, Lisa. And that's the value of having a theory in mind.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about objects, object constancy, and objects that occur.
Mm-hmm.
For those who have narcissistic personality disorder, it seems as though they have a damaged sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, do they experience themselves as a self, a whole person, or do they experience themselves as an object?
That's a very, very good question. Let me answer it by way of an example. Maybe that's a good way to do it, since in the first part we did more theory than clinical, although we did some of that. Let me give an example of this. Let's say you meet a new person, right? And you have these sort of what we call bad or like malignant introjects. I mentioned in part one that introjects easily get projected because this critical voice, this critical way of thinking about yourself, right? It's not well integrated. So you could see how it would lend itself well then to projection. So what happens when you get in a new relationship, you project this bad, right? If we could call it that, introject, right? Like object onto that person. So now what happens is that person becomes, in my field, what we call like a fantasy external object. And we use the word object because they're not a whole person. And we went over this again a little bit earlier, relating to them, like I mentioned, like as a caricature. In other words, you just see the worst aspects of them, and then they get amplified in your mind. So this happens in part because you have these really bad feelings inside of you that you can't tolerate. So you project them. So when you meet somebody new, in a way, you're not really meeting somebody new, because you see them through the eyes of these bad or malignant introjects. So when you see them that way, Lisa, what happens is naturally they become dangerous, untrustworthy, or depriving, whatever it was that you grew up with in your childhood with the important caregivers in your life, but they're not there for you when you need them, right? And then you, because you see them this way, actually may become frightened of them. So I'm starting with the other, but this is to your question, Lisa, because let me finish the cycle, okay? Oh, by the way, I did mention this in the first video, that this is what we call the projective-introjective cycle, malignant cycle, that needs to be broken when relating to somebody like this. I'm answering your question by first talking about how you see somebody else, because that's the projection. So yes, to the first part is you see other people as objects because you're projecting parts of your bad self onto them. But then what happens is, to defend yourself against these bad objects, right? These hostilities, you do what? You may become angry, you may become hostile, or very common with narcissistic individuals, dismissing. You withdraw, or you make it like someone is like, you don't really care about them. They're not too important. And in turn, what happens then, unfortunately, is this makes the other person angry at you, right? Because you're devaluing them or dismissing them, and then they're more likely to leave you. So I want to keep going, but I want to pause just for a second, just to let you jump in with the first part. So the first part is this: something is going on inside this kind of person. It gets projected onto the new person, who's not really a new person entirely, because it's like this repetition compulsion. They just keep, that's why you hear some people say, oh, I can never meet a nice guy. And you have to wonder, or I always meet abusive men. That's another one. You have to wonder, how much of a knack do they have for choosing these men, which is partly true. But and the other part is, how much do they turn them into, not intentionally, not even consciously aware, but when you project and then you defend yourself and you withdraw or treat somebody in a hostile way, they're going to respond to that naturally, right? Because they're in this with you. Okay, but let me just breathe for a second and see what your thoughts or reactions are to that piece of it.
That makes me think this must be the reason why people with NPD are constantly seeking the perfect relationship,
Hmm.
because it starts out well, but then they project the negative onto the other person. Let's say they have a disagreement. Everyone has disagreements, but perhaps the person with NPD doesn't see it that way and projects their negative view of self onto this other person, or their negative introjects onto this other person. And then the relationship becomes bad.
Yep. And just to add one thing, that's exactly right. And they don't see it this way. Why? Why don't they see it as just a disagreement? Because of this whole thing about, remember, introjects and everything being in such an extreme, and because of splitting, and because of the lack of integration, like good and bad, they don't see it as just an agreement because they lose sight of all the good aspects of their partner. They just disappear. That's part of splitting. It's like it could have been there just 5 minutes ago, and they could have really appreciated you or look forward to seeing you. They love you. But when they're splitting, that disappears at that moment.
That's also why I think that oftentimes people with NPD, they don't remember. They don't remember that the partner did all of these nice things for them over the years. They're just remembering this impression, right,
Yep.
that they have of them that's most recent.
Yep. Exactly. And I want to speak to that point in particular because you hear a lot of that. A lot of people are really confused about that piece. And then they think that, people sometimes in these relationships end up very wounded and they question, did he ever love me? Did she really ever love me? It didn't feel like today, it doesn't seem like that. But when we went through it, it felt that way. It felt like they cared. See, but then that disappears when they get into that split state of mind. I want to keep going if I may, and then please jump right back in. So part of this cycle, I just mentioned the projection part, right? That things inside oneself are intolerable and they put it onto somebody else. But then what happens is, and again, this is discussed far less in the content, but then you introject. So introjection is part of taking something in. So when you introject, then this new person, right? This new experience will add just more terrifying images to those that are already in you, right? Because you're having this negative experience with this person because you've projected all these parts of yourself onto them. So what happens then is the introjects that are already inside of you, like your inner world, we could just say, remains exactly as it was before. Nothing changes. Why does nothing change? Because you took in then another bad experience. You ended up with another abusive person. So what happens is the external object, and yes, we're using the word object because they're not a whole person yet, right? Because remember, you see them as like a caricature, only the worst aspects of them. So the external object is felt as dangerous and destructive once more. And then that causes you to adopt an even more aggressive and destructive attitude towards that person in self-defense, right? Because if they're so destructive and angry, which again is the projection, now you got to defend yourself. So now that's why it's a cycle, because it's like, I don't know if you've heard this expression, but there's this old expression, the best defense is a strong offense. So like if you go at them strong, this just perpetuates this vicious cycle. And what never happens, unfortunately, which is in the normal course of development, this is early in life, because these problems start early in life, as you know, Lisa, and we discussed in our prior meeting. And early in life, if things go well, positive feelings predominate, and this leads to an attitude towards others that's more friendly. And accordingly, this friendly, warm experience will be introjected. So now you take in, when things go well, these really comforting, soothing, we called it the maternal smile in the prior video. And then what happens is accordingly, their inner world then becomes populated with, more loving, comforting figures. But for those who are suffering with personality disorders, because of the early childhood frustrations, the deprivations, all the things we spoke about, they remain stuck in this unintegrated level, this fragmented sense of self. This is the splitting. And then there's an excess, let's say, of this destructive self? That's the first part of your question now, is do they treat themselves as an object, right? And to some extent, yes, because when you start getting close to these people, like I do, like when I work with them, you begin to hear that they know that something is really off in themselves. That one moment they could feel one way, and they could sustain that for quite some time until they feel, just to use one more term, like a narcissistic slight. They don't call it that, of course, because they're so busy blaming the other person. They don't see that they feel slighted. The feeling is just one of like, look what this other person did to me. Look at how they treated me.
They become very offended.
Yes. Yep. Remember the strong offense then, and that's the cycle, right?
Hey guys, I'm Nick Darland, and I invite you to check out my podcast, Power and Chaos. Here's the truth. We're not the worst things that's ever happened to us, and we're not the worst thing that we've ever done either. Our power lies in how we rise from the chaos. Each week, we dive into real stories of resilience, growth, and leadership. Because chaos doesn't define us, it strengthens us. We're streaming on all major platforms. Subscribe today and discover how to turn adversity into strength.
And the other person, the intimate partner or the sister, brother, coworker, might not even know what they did or said.
Yeah,
right?
This gets very confusing. Yeah, unless Lisa, and this is not very often, they have a capacity to slow things down and say to their significant other, whoa, what just happened here, right? Let's talk about this. And that's part of the work. I mean, if we want to think about this, is it okay if we go in that direction? It's like, how do you relate to somebody like this in your life, right? If you're a practitioner, how do you treat somebody like this? And in short, what I would say, the number one priority is we must break this projective-introjective cycle. And based on this theory, and by the way, this is just one theory in terms of how to work with this, but our theory that we're talking about over these last few episodes is that there are these bad introjects, these negative introjects, right, that are dominating their internal world, leaving little room for good ones, for positive ones to get in. So we need to figure out how to create some space so that they can let good experiences in, because it's this lack of integration between this good and bad, right? That's what leads to this increased level of splitting, which is that whole cycle again. So that's what we need to get into in terms of the work with these individuals.
That sounds very, very complex, I think, to most people. And you lend a very, comprehensive, I think, explanation just about the basics of what this starts to entail. So you're a psychoanalyst. So psychoanalytic theory, I'm sure, can help someone with NPD. And you do other types of therapy. Can you talk with us a little bit about what psychoanalysis is and the other types of therapy you do and what they are?
Yes. So it's not like an intellectual exercise. Let's do it specifically with this example. And I'll try to demonstrate from a psychodynamic perspective, right, what this would look like. So let's say this person who's having this experience comes into my office, right? From the very first moment, Lisa, the goal is to create a different situation with them, right? Because that's the cycle we're trying to break. And the way that we do this initially is through appreciating their subjective experience. And for anyone who's listened to my podcast, they know that I always say this is the first level of intervention, is to get as close as possible to somebody's experience and begin to what we call, this is just a little bit more of like this psychodynamic language. So through the act of containment, these are tools or techniques that we use. So in other words, we don't become reactive when this person starts to do it with us, because they're going to do it with us too, by the way. And that's like what I said before. If you're with a significant other person who could slow things down, that's basically what I do initially, is we try to slow things down. That's what we call containment. And then we know there's so much aggression in there, so we need to detoxify that. In other words, we need to absorb it, try to start thinking about it, and then give it back to them, letting them know that this is their own aggression, which is not easy because they think that it's the other person. But we need to begin to give that back to them in a way that they could use it and not feel attacked or judged or criticized. And we do that through interpretation. We're always acting. I'm always acting very curious and attuned to their stories. And I try to get as close as possible. And in just doing this already begins to differentiate me. And, if we're going through this, like I said, in this example, you come into my office, they know already that I'm different than anybody they've spoken to. Because why? Most likely, more often than not, people they talk to, what do they end up doing to them, Lisa? They end up getting them upset because they're projecting, right? Or they end up accusing them, or they end up getting frustrated with them. So the first order of business is to help, like through this active containment, detoxification, and interpretation comes next. But we distinguish ourselves from most people in their lives. I've heard people say this before, again, in social media content. Well, the narcissist doesn't really stay in therapy very long. Yes, they may come in when they feel deflated. The grandiose sense of self gets deflated. But once they reconstitute their self-esteem, they leave. That's not been my experience. And I think in part the reason is if you could give them a feeling that they're with somebody who really listens and appreciates their subjective experience, it doesn't mean you agree with it, okay? That doesn't mean you have to just sit there and agree that, their wife or their husband is like a covert narcissist or something like that, or whatever name they're calling them. But it means that you validate. You don't gratify their experience, but you validate it. And validation is very different because you're helping them sort of put it in some sort of context, which goes back to what we spoke about earlier, which is trying to understand where is all this coming from? In other words, back to the introjects in their inner world. How is it that you saw this person in that way, right? So that's the sort of the beginning of it, but I could pause there. Lisa, I warned you, I could keep going with this.
No, it's so interesting.
I want you to jump in and, yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And you know what came to mind as you were just describing that? You're putting yourself really in the mindset of the person with NPD first. That's exactly what hostage negotiators do. That's what just popped into my mind.
That's very interesting.
When I heard you say that. Yeah. And so I think because you do that, the person with NPD feels like it's a safer space. Mm-hmm. And I would think that safety is paramount to someone with NPD.
Yes. And I would just add one thing. Safety is paramount, and trust, developing trust, but it's not enough, right?
Right.
It's a good way to start, but eventually what we have to do in a treatment that's going to be long lasting, in other words, lead to lasting change, is we need to begin to show them how frequently and how often or automatically they interpret things as if somebody always has malignant intent, right? Because that's the projection. So in psychodynamic psychotherapy, we're not dealing with helping them get along with somebody necessarily, although that would be the outcome, because as you can begin to create some space, when trust develops and you help them begin to reflect on how everybody has this malignant intent, and they begin to see that this is not a new relationship. Because if you're with these people over some time, and then it repeats itself with you, right? Now this is really where it's the value of the work is when this happens with you in the room and it comes alive. That's what we call the transference. And working in the transference in that way is really valuable because now, you don't really ever know these other characters in their life. And maybe to some extent, these other people do have malignant intent. It's possible they do. But in general, I don't think I do. And if I do, I have to really slow down and reflect on that, by the way, if that's what I'm being accused of. But if I figure out that I don't have malignant intent, now we can begin to help them really sort of distinguish between the way that I'm actually behaving, right? Like the reality to this, and how they imagine I'm behaving. And then that, of course, would lead into how they are recreating what we call, again, just to borrow a little bit of jargon, an archaic fantasy object. And that goes back to our first conversation with those early introjects. Those are those caregivers who were either abusive or neglectful or inconsistent parenting. Remember, we spoke about that. So those are the archaic fantasy objects that get projected. So the first order of business is after you develop trust, actually, I should say the second order, there is sort of a way you need to do this, because if you rush it and you interpret this stuff too early, they're not going to trust you. They'll just feel criticized and attacked if they don't have the space to take this kind of thing in. They'll just insist that you really are trying to, I don't know, you really did end the session early, and they'll insist on that. So anyway, so that would be sort of the second step, is to help them become aware of the distinction between their archaic object and the real external person. That's who you are, and that's who they're talking to right now. And when this goes well, this is one way in which psychodynamic psychotherapy is mutative, since it produces now a breach in that vicious projective-introjective malignant cycle that I described earlier. I just described one way psychodynamic psychotherapy works. In the next episode, we'll dive deeper into the therapeutic techniques and tools that I find to be helpful when living with or trying to negotiate narcissistic characteristics. We will explore concepts like containment, detoxification, and interpretation, and I will describe how these approaches help create a different relational experience and break what we call the projection-introjection malignant cycle. Okay, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.